Good morning. I want to begin by thanking the committee for the opportunity to address what I consider to be one of the most consequential and, frankly, most preventable economic disruptions to emerge in the North American trade landscape in the past 2 decades. What we are witnessing today is not simply a bilateral dispute between two neighboring nations. What we are witnessing is the direct, measurable, and accelerating consequence of using tariff policy as a geopolitical instrument without fully accounting for the retaliatory capacity of a trading partner as deeply integrated into our supply chains, our energy infrastructure, and our agricultural economy as Canada has historically been. Let me be precise about the numbers, because precision matters enormously when we are talking about the livelihoods of American workers, American farmers, and American manufacturers. The figure that has now entered the public record, $9.3 billion in U.S. exports rejected or formally redirected away from American suppliers overnight, is not a projection. It is not a worst-case scenario modeled by a think tank. It is a realized economic outcome. It is the kind of number that, when it appears in a single reporting cycle, forces every serious economist, every trade policy analyst, and every member of this committee to stop and ask a fundamental question. How did we arrive here? And more importantly, what does the path forward look like from a position that is now measurably weaker than it was 18 months ago? To understand the full weight of that $9.3 billion figure, I think it is important that we contextualize it within the broader architecture of the U.S. Canada trade relationship, because that relationship has for decades been the single largest bilateral trading relationship in the world. Prior to the current escalation cycle, the United States and Canada exchanged approximately $2.7 trillion in goods and services over a rolling 5-year period. That is not background noise in the American economy. That is the foundation upon which entire industries, automotive manufacturing in Michigan and Ohio, agricultural exports from the Great Plains, energy infrastructure across the northern tier states, softwood lumber supply chains feeding the American housing market, have been constructed and optimized over generations. When you introduce sudden, sharp tariff escalation into a relationship that tightly coupled, you are not simply adjusting prices at the margin. You are sending a signal to every Canadian procurement officer, every Canadian government ministry, and every Canadian business executive that the reliability of the American supply relationship can no longer be assumed. And once that signal is sent clearly enough, the response is not panic. The response is planning. Methodical, strategic, and in this case, remarkably well-executed planning. Prime Minister Carney's administration did not react emotionally to the escalation in U.S. tariff posture. That is the detail that I believe Washington underestimated most severely. What we observed from Ottawa was a calibrated, sequenced economic response that drew on pre-existing diplomatic relationships, on trade architecture that Canada had been quietly reinforcing since the first round of NAFTA renegotiations, and on a clear-eyed assessment of where American export dependence was most concentrated and therefore most vulnerable to redirection. The $9.3 billion in rejected U.S. exports did not represent Canada simply turning away American goods out of frustration or national pride. It represented the activation of alternative supply agreements that, in many categories, had been under quiet negotiation for the better part of 2 years. That is the timeline we need to sit with. While Washington was focused on the leverage it believed tariffs would generate, Ottawa was building the infrastructure to make that leverage structurally irrelevant. Let me turn now to the specific sectoral composition of that $9.3 billion, because the breakdown is instructive and should inform every element of the emergency trade discussions that I am told are now being organized for early 2026. The largest single component of the rejected export figure sits in agricultural commodities, and within that category, wheat and processed food products account for a disproportionate share. American wheat exporters had long operated under the assumption that Canadian import demand, particularly for specialty grains and processed agricultural inputs used in the Canadian food manufacturing sector, represented a stable and captive market. That assumption has now been empirically invalidated. Canadian procurement has pivoted with striking speed toward European and Australian suppliers, in several cases locking in multi-year forward contracts that will not be easily unwound even if bilateral trade relations normalize. This is the nature of commodity contract structures. Once a buyer establishes a new supplier relationship and invests in the logistics, quality certification, and regulatory alignment that relationship requires, the switching costs become real, and the American exporter does not simply reclaim that market by offering a lower price next quarter. The second major sectoral component involves manufactured goods and industrial inputs, particularly in the steel adjacent and aluminum adjacent manufacturing categories. Here, the story is somewhat different but equally concerning from a long term competitiveness standpoint. Canada's retaliatory tariff structure, combined with the Carney administration's active industrial policy push to onshore more value added manufacturing within Canadian borders, has begun to redirect purchasing decisions that previously flowed automatically to American suppliers. I want to be very clear about what that means in practical terms. It means that factories in Ontario and Quebec that were buying American manufactured components 18 months ago are today qualifying new suppliers in Germany, South Korea, and in several categories, domestic Canadian producers who have received accelerated federal support to scale their capacity. Again, this is not a temporary disruption. This is a structural realignment, and structural realignments do not reverse themselves simply because a tariff is lifted. The third component, and in many ways the most strategically significant over a 10 to 15-year horizon, involves energy adjacent exports and the technology and equipment inputs that support energy infrastructure development. Canada is in the midst of an ambitious energy diversification program, and that program requires substantial capital equipment, engineering services, and technology licensing. Historically, a significant share of that procurement would have flowed to American firms. What we are now observing is an accelerated effort by the Carney government to qualify European and Asian suppliers for these contracts, explicitly as a mechanism for reducing strategic dependence on American commercial relationships that are now perceived as politically unreliable. The long-term revenue implications for American engineering firms and technology exporters are substantial, and they will not appear in next quarter's trade statistics. They will appear 5 years from now when the contracts have been executed, the relationships have been established, and the American firms have lost their incumbent advantage. I raise all of this not to assign blame in a partisan sense, and I want to be very deliberate about that. Trade policy errors have been made across administrations, and the underlying tensions in the U.S. Canada relationship did not emerge from a vacuum. But I do believe that the specific mechanism of escalatory tariff deployment applied to a partner whose economic integration with the United States is as deep and as structurally embedded as Canada's represents a category of policy error that carries consequences well beyond the immediate bilateral dispute. It affects our credibility with every other trading partner who is watching how Washington manages this relationship. It affects the willingness of allied governments to enter into new trade commitments with the United States when they observe that existing commitments can be overridden by executive action without legislative constraint. And it affects the domestic American economy in ways that are now becoming visible in the export rejection data, in the agricultural income figures, and in the forward order books of manufacturers across the industrial Midwest. The emergency trade talks being organized for 2026 are necessary, and I support them fully. But I want to be direct with this committee about the context in which those talks will occur. The United States will be entering those negotiations from a position in which $9.3 billion in export relationships have already been redirected, in which Canadian alternative supply chains are already partially operational, and in which the Carney government has demonstrated both the political will and the economic capacity to absorb the costs of reorientation. That is a different negotiating environment than the one that existed 18 months ago, and our approach to those talks must be calibrated accordingly. We are not arriving as the unambiguous economic hegemon dictating terms. We are arriving as a partner that has created a significant problem and now needs to demonstrate convincingly and through concrete policy commitments that the reliability of the American trade relationship has been restored. That is the framing I would ask this committee to carry into its own deliberations, and it is the framing that should guide the executive branch's preparation for the 2026 discussions. The question before us is not simply how to resolve this particular dispute. The question is how to rebuild the structural trust that makes the entire architecture of North American economic integration function in the interest of American workers and American businesses. That is a larger task. It is a more urgent task than I think Washington has fully internalized. And it is the task to which I intend to dedicate the remainder of my remarks across the subsequent sections of this testimony. I want to begin this portion of my testimony by addressing something that I think has been insufficiently examined in the public discourse surrounding the $9.3 billion export rejection figure, and that is the question of velocity. Not simply the scale of the redirection, but the speed at which it occurred. Because when economists and trade policy analysts talk about supply chain realignment, the conventional assumption embedded in most models is that these transitions take time. They take time because they require new supplier qualification processes, new logistics infrastructure, new regulatory harmonization, new financial settlement arrangements, and new relationship building at the commercial and diplomatic level simultaneously. The conventional wisdom has long held that even a motivated trading partner with strong political will to diversify away from a dominant supplier relationship would require anywhere from 3 to 7 years to execute a meaningful structural shift. What the $9.3 billion overnight rejection figure tells us is that in Canada's case, that transition timeline was dramatically compressed, and understanding why it was compressed is essential to understanding both the immediate crisis and the longer-term strategic challenge facing American exporters. The answer, when you examine it carefully, comes down to preparation, and I use that word in its most precise economic sense. The Carney government did not improvise a response to American tariff escalation. What became visible overnight in the export rejection data was the activation of a response architecture that had been methodically constructed over an extended preparatory period. The diplomatic groundwork had been laid. The alternative supplier relationships had been identified, vetted, and in many cases partially formalized through memoranda of understanding and preliminary commercial agreements. The regulatory frameworks needed to accept goods from new source countries had been pre-negotiated or were sufficiently advanced that final qualification could be completed rapidly. The financial instruments needed to support new payment flows in different currencies with different counterparties had been arranged. In other words, Canada did not build its escape route after the tariffs landed. Canada built its escape route while the tariff escalation was still unfolding, and that distinction has profound implications for how we think about American leverage in the upcoming 2026 negotiations. I want to spend some time on the agricultural dimension of this situation because I believe it deserves sustained attention from this committee and from the executive branch agencies that will be preparing the American negotiating position. The United States has for generations maintained a structural trade surplus with Canada in certain agricultural categories, and that surplus has been treated by American farm policy as a reliable and essentially permanent feature of the bilateral economic landscape. What the current disruption has revealed is that this assumption of permanence was not grounded in the underlying economics of the relationship so much as it was grounded in habit, in convenience, and in the absence of motivated alternatives. Once Canada had sufficient political motivation to seek those alternatives, and once the Carney government was willing to absorb the short-term transition costs involved in establishing them, the structural surplus that American agricultural exporters had come to depend upon proved far more fragile than the long-term trend data suggested. Let me be specific about the wheat situation because I think it illustrates the broader dynamic with particular clarity. American hard red winter wheat and hard red spring wheat have historically commanded strong positions in the Canadian milling and food processing sector, not primarily because of price advantage, though price was certainly a factor, but because of the deep integration of the North American grain handling and transportation infrastructure. Canadian millers buying American wheat were operating within a logistics ecosystem that had been optimized over decades, with established rail connections, established grain elevator relationships, established quality certification protocols, and established financial settlement mechanisms. All of that integration created a form of commercial inertia that insulated American wheat exporters from competitive pressure, even when Australian or European wheat was available at comparable or lower prices. What the tariff escalation did was provide the political and economic justification for Canadian buyers to absorb the friction costs of breaking that inertia and establishing the new logistical pathways needed to source from alternative origins. And here is the critical point that I want this committee to understand clearly. Those friction costs are largely one-time costs. You pay them once when you establish the new supplier relationship, qualify the new logistics pathway, and negotiate the new commercial terms. Once those costs have been absorbed, the alternative supply chain operates at roughly the same efficiency as the one it replaced, which means that even if American wheat becomes competitively priced again, even if the tariff environment normalizes, Canadian millers who have already absorbed the switching costs will not automatically return to American suppliers. They will evaluate the American relationship against the new alternative relationship on its current merits, and those merits will now include the very significant consideration of supply reliability and political risk. An American wheat exporter competing for renewed Canadian business in 2026 or 2027 will be competing not just on price and quality, but on the question of whether Washington can be trusted not to repeat the policy escalation that triggered the disruption in the first place. That is a question to which American exporters cannot themselves provide a credible answer. Only consistent, sustained, institutionally grounded trade policy can provide that answer, and we are not yet in a position to offer it. The manufacturing sector tells a parallel story, though the specific mechanisms differ in important ways. I mentioned in my opening remarks that Canadian purchasing of American manufactured components and industrial inputs has begun to shift toward European and Asian suppliers. I want to elaborate on the structural drivers of that shift because they are not simply reactive. They are, in several important respects, consistent with a broader Canadian industrial policy agenda that the Carney government has articulated with increasing clarity, and that the current trade disruption has given both the political justification and the economic urgency to accelerate. Canada has for some time been seeking to increase the domestic value-added content of its manufacturing sector, to reduce what its policymakers describe as excessive integration with the American industrial ecosystem, and to develop more diversified international commercial relationships that reduce its strategic vulnerability to shifts in American trade policy. The tariff escalation has not created this agenda. It has supercharged it, and it has given the Carney government a domestic political mandate to pursue it that would have been difficult to generate in a less charged environment. What this means in practical terms is that when American manufacturers look at the pipeline of Canadian procurement that has shifted away from them, they are not looking at a temporary demand interruption that will self-correct when trade tensions ease. They are looking at a deliberate, policy-driven industrial restructuring process that is being actively supported by Canadian federal resources, by Canadian regulatory adaptation, and by Canadian diplomatic engagement with alternative supplier nations. European manufacturers, particularly in Germany, have been among the primary beneficiaries of this shift, and they have responded with considerable agility, offering Canadian buyers not just competitive pricing, but enhanced service commitments, localization investments, and in several cases, joint venture arrangements that deepen the commercial relationship in ways that create their own structural switching costs. We are, in other words, watching the construction of a new set of commercial inertias to replace the ones that American manufacturers previously benefited from, and the window for American firms to compete effectively for this business is narrowing with each passing quarter. I turn now to what I consider the most underappreciated dimension of the current situation, which is the financial and monetary dimension of the trade disruption. When 9.3 billion in US exports are redirected overnight, the effects are not limited to the trade account. They ripple through the financial system in ways that are less visible in the headline data, but no less consequential for American economic health. Let me walk through the primary transmission channels as I understand them, because I think this committee needs to have a clear picture of the full economic scope of what we are dealing with. The first transmission channel runs through the agricultural financial system. American farmers who had priced their production, arranged their financing, and structured their forward contracts on the assumption of stable Canadian demand are now facing a demand shortfall that forces them into spot markets, into alternative export channels, or in the worst cases, into storage and carrying cost situations that erode their operating margins significantly. Farm income projections across the Great Plains and the upper Midwest have already been revised downward in response to the Canadian export disruption, and the downstream effects on rural banking, on agricultural equipment purchasing, and on rural community economic activity are beginning to materialize in the regional Federal Reserve data. These are not abstract macroeconomic effects. These are real income losses being experienced by real farming families and real rural communities, and they deserve to be treated with the same seriousness as any other category of economic harm. The second transmission channel runs through the manufacturing sector's capital investment decisions. When American manufacturers observe that a significant and previously reliable export market has been disrupted by policy action, the rational response is to reassess capital investment plans that were premised on serving that market. Plant expansions get deferred, equipment purchases get delayed, hiring plans get revised. These investment pullbacks do not show up immediately in the GDP data, but they accumulate over time into a meaningful drag on productive capacity growth, and they are particularly damaging in precisely the industrial categories: steel, aluminum, advanced manufacturing, that American industrial policy is simultaneously trying to strengthen. There is a direct and damaging contradiction between the goal of rebuilding American industrial capacity and the trade policy actions that are simultaneously undermining the export markets that make that industrial capacity economically viable. The third transmission channel, and the one that concerns me most from a long-term structural perspective, involves the dollar's role in bilateral trade settlement and the broader question of currency denomination in North American commerce. I want to be careful here not to overstate what is currently a modest and early stage development, but the data does show that a small but growing share of Canadian trade with non-American partners is being settled in currencies other than the US dollar. This is a rational response by Canadian businesses to a trade environment in which diversification away from American commercial relationships is being actively encouraged by government policy. It does not represent an immediate threat to dollar primacy, and I want to be clear about that. But it is a directional indicator that warrants serious monitoring, because the dollar's role as the dominant currency of North American trade is itself a form of structural advantage for the United States that we should be very cautious about eroding, even at the margins. All of these transmission channels, agricultural income, manufacturing investment, currency settlement, point toward the same fundamental conclusion. The costs of the current trade disruption are not confined to the export sectors directly affected by Canadian purchasing redirection. They are diffusing through the American economy in ways that are broader, more persistent, and more structurally consequential than the headline $9.3 billion figure alone would suggest. And they are diffusing in a direction that will make the task of American economic recovery from this disruption more difficult the longer the underlying policy conditions that generated it remain in place. This is the economic reality that must inform the preparation for the 2026 emergency trade talks, and it is a reality that I intend to address in considerable additional detail as my testimony continues.